All right, so I'm going to talk to you about my research, which is on vulnerability to sea level rise. And I'd like to start off with a quote from Tony Oliver Smith, who's a well-known anthropologist who's really well-known in the field of hazards research. The complexity of the interrelationships between ecological and social systems at multiple levels makes crafting a policy-relevant research agenda on the social impacts of sea level rise a challenging task because it requires combining global projections with their local and regional manifestations with local patterns of vulnerability that are socially and economically constructed by local, regional, and global processes. It's a long quote, but I feel like it captures the essence of my research in a very succinct, relatively succinct way. So briefly, I'm going to go over a couple of key concepts and key points so we're all on the same page in terms of like what I mean by vulnerability and how I'm thinking about it and why this research is important. I'll review the study site where I'm going to do this research, go over a pilot project, and then throw at you an integrative proposal, what I'm calling integrative anyway, but focus mostly on the method. So I'm going to stay pretty clear of some of the theory, aside from maybe what that quote was hinting at today. So we're already committed to greater than 1.3 meters of sea level rise. Over 10% of the population, the global population, lives less than 10 meters above current sea levels. In the US, bringing it home a little, there are 2 million homes and over 3 million residents that are located less than a meter above high tide, exposing them directly to inundation from sea level rise. And morally and ethically speaking, developed nations are the most responsible for global warming due to our carbon emissions. So some of the key points I'm trying to make today are that assessing risk to sea level rise requires more than the calculation of hazard exposure and economic impacts, which is where a lot of the social research focuses. It also requires more than identifying where there are socially vulnerable populations. I contend, along with many social theorists, that it is socially produced and that it emerges within a situated context through the dynamic interactions of people, ecology, politics, and material objects. And this is actually coming out of the work on social natures, which is some of the theory that I'm alluding to. So some key questions that I'm focusing on in a very generally written way are what characteristics define social vulnerability? Where are socially vulnerable populations located? And I know that contrasts with what I was just saying. I wasn't saying that that isn't important. It's important, but it's important to go a step beyond that and to understand why these populations are socially vulnerable. And in the context of my research, why are they socially vulnerable to the specific hazard of sea level rise? So to give some common definitions here, I'll read these quotes again. Social vulnerability from Tony Oliver Smith's perspective is that it's the conceptual nexus that links the relationship people have with their environment to social forces and institutions and the cultural values that sustain or contest them. Now, a more popular definition in the hazards field is this by Ben Wisner et al., the characteristics of a person or group and their situation that influence their capacity to, and these are important points, anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from the impact of a natural hazard. And one way to conceptually think about it is this equation that Wisner et al. Have put out, which is that risk is the product of hazard times vulnerability. And hazard being the exposure, and vulnerability, in this case, the way they define it, always focusing on the social element. So sea level rise, there are multiple projections for sea level rise. For those of you who don't do research on sea level rise or don't pay attention to the news media, Sandy certainly brought it into our frame of reference for most of us, that range from 0.2 meters to 2 meters. And the higher end are based on paleo records and semi-empirical models, whereas the lower ends are based on more theoretical models that look at current rates of ice melt and thermal expansion based on physical theory. The consensus is around 1 meter, and these data are from NOAA, and so most people focus on developing adaptation plans for around 1 meter or so right now by the year 2100. So now I'm going to move on to the study site, which is Georgia. So I'm working on the Georgia coast, which is roughly 100 miles long, which is just an interesting factoid. It has over 2,000 miles of shoreline that sinuously wind around 75 square miles of tidal wetland, which is this area here in green on the map. Of that 75 square miles of tidal wetland, about 40 square miles of that is salt marsh, which is very important as a fisheries habitat. It's important for people's livelihoods, and it also constitutes roughly 1/3 of all the salt marsh found on the Atlantic coast of the US. And So the area in purple would be the area that would be inundated, assuming no man-made or human-made infrastructure was developed to prevent 3 feet of sea level rise. So that just shows you where sea level would increase on the coast here. So to throw a couple of pictures at you and a couple of facts, there are about 600,000 people that live on the Georgia coast. From 2000 to 2010, there was a 19% population growth rate, and that's predicted to increase to roughly 50% by the year 2030. So we have a growing population and increasing sea levels, so we have these two things coming at a head. And currently there are 34,000 people and 18,000 homes that live less than a meter above high tide on the Georgia coast. And the Georgia ocean economy, which largely includes the tourism and recreation sector, generates $1.1 billion, and about half of that is in the tourism and recreation sector. So these are just some basic factoid about the coast here. And then on the Georgia coast, we've seen about a rate of 1 foot per century, roughly 9 to 10 inches since 1935, as measured empirically by a tidal gauge at Fort Pulaski, which is just outside of Savannah. And what we have with that occurring is we have these developments that were built on infill or marsh hammocks, that when we have heavy precipitation events at extremely high tides that are triggered by lunar cycles, we end up with this kind of flooding in residential areas. And this is becoming a common occurrence on much of the coast in Georgia and elsewhere, especially in Florida. This happens in Miami all the time. This is a picture on Tybee Island. So how do we deal with this? How do we analyze social vulnerability to sea level rise? Well, a lot of the current practice takes the approach that we took in this pilot study. I'm calling it a pilot study for my research, but technically it was a study we were doing for Glenn County on the coast here, as I was a research assistant with the Carl Vinson Institute. And the way that we did this was we used the Social Vulnerability Index, which is developed by Susan Cutter in her lab at the University of South Carolina, which spatially identifies geographic variation in relative levels of social vulnerability by modeling US Census data. And it's intended to be useful for policymakers and practitioners when they're planning on how to allocate resources to their more socially vulnerable areas. And I'll show you a map of that in a minute, maybe make a little more sense, why it would be easily useful, though misleadingly useful perhaps. And the way they do this, just to throw this out there, is that they use a principal components analysis and whittle all these 30 different socioeconomic and demographic variables that are defined by case studies, typically ethnographic studies, to say that, oh, this is why people are socially vulnerable, because they're in poverty. Speaking of poverty, they're elderly, right? So all these characteristics are thrown together to create this all-inclusive hazards index that says, okay, you guys are generally more socially vulnerable that live in this area. So this is the results, and I don't really want to go into the detail, but we basically created this 3-tier system. And these areas that are outlined here in black are US Census block groups that have anywhere from, on average, 3,000 people, but for Glenn County, anywhere from 500 to 5,000 people. And again, the SOVI index, or the SOVI model, is measuring relative social vulnerability. And so what we see is that anything more than half a standard deviation above the average for the county, the average index, is considered elevated. So it's a very subjective measurement. But whenever policymakers and planners see this kind of a map, they jump all over it because they're like, oh, okay, so this is where we focus resources whenever we're thinking about hazards evacuation. And then to look at exposure, we overlaid a storm surge and sea level rise and a few things, but here I'm most interested in sea level rise. We have to scale up the sea level rise data, right? The inundation exposure. And that's, again, here what we do is we take the percentage of dry land in each block group and convert it so they're basically the same scale. The social vulnerability assessment and the hazard to sea level rise assessment look the same. And when we do that, we generate a similar looking map for sea level rise exposure. So see, we're taking exposure and vulnerability and we're multiplying them to identify risk. That's the idea. And so this is calculated in the same way. It's the average for the county, and like you would expect, the more elevated areas are those closer to the coast. And so what we do, like I was saying, is we add these together and we generate a bivariate map that basically along this diagonal axis is showing relative increasing risk. High social vulnerability and elevated hazard exposure to sea level rise in this case. And you can do this for multiple assessments, multiple different types of hazard exposure. So a lot of my research is like, I'm interested in this because of the modeling aspect of it. I really like that. I like the GIS, the geographic analysis stuff. But does combining models of social vulnerability with hazard exposure allow us to actually see what's happening? I mean, it helps us locate where people are who might be more socially vulnerable, given other case studies at different sites that suggest what social vulnerability is. And so my research is about asking, what can an integrative lens, where if we kind of take a mixed methods approach and bring multiple lenses, multiple theoretical lenses, and apply them to this research, this question, what will that allow us to see? And in the remaining time here, I'm going to show you a conceptual model that's focused on the methods again. And the thing about the theory for me is that the social theory is kind of reading through and across all of this. And I don't have a conceptual diagram. I do have a Venn diagram that's a little bit much for people. I've been told it looks like a flower. Some of you have seen it. But so what I'm doing is, this is the timeline of my dissertation, is the idea, and that I'll do a regional ethnography and use the outputs of that to help define some of the modeling of social vulnerability to sea level rise. So interviews and focus groups at the regional level, and then the modeling outputs will help me define some case study sites to go in and do local ethnography. And I show you the simple conceptual model because when you blow it up a little bit, it gets a little bit more like a plate of spaghetti, as some have called things like this. So I'll walk you through this step by step. So this is kind of the proposed methodology for my research. And so here in phase one, let's call it, I will do regional interviews with planners and emergency managers and other, and I know this word is problematic for many people, key stakeholders, people who work in NGOs or organizations across the region of the coast, in order to try to better define social vulnerability, specifically to sea level rise. So to basically create a SOVI model, the Social Vulnerability Index, that's specific to sea level rise rather than this all-inclusive thing. What particular things make people socially vulnerable to sea level rise? And the outputs from that I will use in a modeling approach and overlay, just as I was showing you in the pilot study, the social vulnerability assessment, but one that's been modified to be very specific to sea level rise characteristics with hazard exposure. And ideally, I'll be able, this is something I'm still working on, develop a sea level rise hazard exposure geographic map that incorporates more than just inundation from sea level rise, right? Because there are other students in the program who are, and myself included, who are looking at what kind of exposures are people going to experience other than inundation from sea level rise, right? It's not just that, oh, I live on the coast and my property is going to be flooded. Maybe the marsh goes away and so my livelihood's affected, right? So there are other pathways that sea level rise hazard exposes people. And when I overlay those, I'll identify where people are socially located in order to choose a couple of case study sites and where I'll go in and do household surveys and household interviews, basically doing what a lot of anthropologists do, an assessment of adaptive capacity, a livelihoods assessment, and use the results from that to, not to fully, it's impossible, but to situate, to contextualize on the Georgia coast how people, how people are socially vulnerable and what their ability to adapt to sea level rise is. Adaptive capacity assessments tend to, like a livelihood assessment, looks at things like natural capital, social capital, physical capital, and I don't have all these words up here, but like, what are your financial assets? Can you move if you need to move? Do you have a high education? Are you able to choose a different career line if the shrimping industry collapses because the salt marsh goes away? And that, for me, allows us to get to the deeper, more root causes of why people are socially vulnerable so that we can actually do something about it. And so with that, I want to conclude, because that's the motivation of my research, with a quote from Mark Pelling, which is that climate change adaptation is an opportunity for social reform, for the questioning of values that drive inequalities in development and our unsustainable relationship with the environment. So that's it, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Is there time?
2 minutes.
Okay, cool. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, on the social vulnerability index, I saw it. So Jekyll Island was the key place there, and you know, I know a little bit about that community, and they're older, but also semi-wealthy.
Right.
So I was wondering about, like, because I felt like you said that poor communities were more vulnerable,
Right, elderly is equally weighted in the social vulnerability index.
That's what I was gonna, like the weighting of these things, because that kind of surprised me and it was kind of interesting. So I wonder if you had any critiques on the weighting involved in creation.
I have lots of critiques on the SOVI model. And the developers of the SOVI model have lots of critiques of their own model, right? Modeling is challenging, and that's a large part of why I want to do regional ethnography and to get involved with people so that I can show them and explain to them how the model works on some level at least, in order to get input on, is this more important than this, and to develop a locally socially defined set of variables for sea level rise, which will have its own inherent problems for sure. That's the challenge of modeling, is like you simplify the world unavoidably. Thanks. Cool. Oh, Bram?
You have an interesting ethnic subculture there on the Georgia coast, is the Geechee.
Yes.
I wonder if their cultural uniqueness makes them, plus relative poverty, puts them in a particularly vulnerable spot in how the model would pick them up.